So there's this perspective within management, and I abide by this perspective, where what we try to do is we try to learn the outside world, right? We have this sort of arena that we're playing in, a landscape that we're playing in, and we don't necessarily understand what this landscape looks like. And the way that we learn this particular landscape is we try things that may or may not work. And as we try these things, try these different alternatives, and there's lots of research that sort of supports this in decision making theory, both in as well as in strategy and management literature. This is a really consistent understanding of the world that the world is uncertain. We have this sort of landscape that's called sort of a rough landscape. This is Dan Leventhal pointed this idea out, and you look at the landscape, and you're trying to go up in a hill climbing effort, find the maximum hill. But you don't know what that hill is. It's completely blind to you. And so you have to try things, or you have to try different actions. There's another sort of perspective that is used a lot. Hart Posen at Dartmouth, who is one of Dan Leventhal's students, uses this a fair bit. The sort of idea um, of a multi-arm bandit problem, where you have a certain alternative. You could choose a certain alternative, or you can choose an uncertain alternative that you don't know, and the goal is to sort of search to find the things that are uncertain, right? And to find, so the certain alternative, you know what the outcome is, that you're going to make $100, versus an uncertain alternative, you may make zero, or you might make $1 million by pursuing this particular thing, and you don't know what those outcomes are. And it's your job to learn those particular outcomes by trying those things. So, in the realm of entrepreneurship, right? So this is something that I've learned. Um, what does that actually feel like, right? If you're pursuing something that is entrepreneurial, right? So from the Reciprocity Project, what I've learned is that it very much feels like you're wasting resources, right? You're wasting your time. You're wasting your efforts. You are spending too much money. You are doing all of these actions that do not have an immediate return with what you're doing. And so because it doesn't have an immediate return, it's not certain in any sort of way, it feels like wasting. It feels like you're doing something bad. It feels like your actions are completely irrelevant. Now, in the management literature, particularly the sort of strategy literature that sort of talks about this, right? We have this story, as Jim March pointed out many years ago, of where James G. March, one of the sort of fathers of this area, we have this notion of exploration exploitation. And this idea is that we can sort of exploit the known alternatives that we have, much like this sort of multi-arm bandit problem. We can exploit the known understandings that we have, or which is sort of exploitation, or we sort of pursue things and we explore things that are on opportunities in an unknown universe. Now, that is a very positive perspective, in the sense, not necessarily positive in the sense of sort of empiricism, sort of positivist empiricism, but a positive perspective in that how you feel about this within the social norms of what you're actually doing. Remember, all of this feels like norm violations, right? It feels negative. It feels bad. It feels like you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing. And all of that, right? All of that feels like you're wasting. It feels like you are throwing resources out the window, like you're driving along and you don't know what you're doing, and you've got a hundreds of dollars of bills in your, many bills in your hand, and you're driving along, you're just throwing it out the window. And so as you're doing this, right, you cannot necessarily do any net present value calculations on things that are sort of exploratory and doing things that are innovative, or doing things where you're building something that doesn't exist, right? So the reciprocity project was something that didn't exist. And it was something that I thought that there was a real need for it, right? I needed help, and there was nothing that available on the market, right? There was nothing that I can turn to get help. There was no sort of platform that could provide feedback for me and do it in a reasonable manner. And all of this was sort of within the context of, you have to do it yourself. Um, and the sort of challenging thing is that is depicted within particularly entrepreneurship research, um, and even within the sort of notion of Silicon Valley, it's often depicted by folks that haven't gone through this, right? So when you go through this, you dedicate, and almost always you watch or you listen to investors, right, that are doing sort of early stage tech investing. They almost always look for, skin in the game. So what does that mean? That means you've invested yourself as the entrepreneur substantially into something. And to know what is the right amount is kind of an arbitrary thing, right? Like sometimes you see some people investing far too much and they lose everything. And that's like kind of crazy. And then sometimes people just don't invest enough and you don't know what is the right amount. It's kind of an arbitrary thing. But that entire process, right? The whole thing feels like you're wasting resources and you're never going to recoup those resources in the future. And that might be the case where it feels negative. It feels, in some sense, it feels dirty, right? It feels like, ugh, I shouldn't be doing this thing. And people are going to make fun of me for doing this thing. And look at all the stuff that I'm wasting. It's either, people are going to make fun of you. It's not the right thing to do. This is not what we do around here. All of that kind of stuff, right? It's all negative connotations in terms of investing. And this is what you should experience or imagine what you're going to do, and to give you a real sense of what this feels like. Everybody knows. I want you to sort of imagine that you have whatever amount that you have to your name, right? So maybe you have $10,000 to your name. Well, imagine taking $1,000 of that, so 10% of your wealth, and then throwing it out the window on something that is somewhat of a pipe dream, right? You think it's just like, this is all right. And so what does that mean, right? Like that means that you're foregoing, going out for dinner, for example. It means foregoing spending time and efforts in other ways that give you pleasure, right? It's immediate response where you're throwing things out the window that have no immediate benefit, right? And that is the challenging thing. We actually talk about, and I remember reading this HBR article, I believe, or Sloan Management Review article many years ago, talking about sort of the valley or the dip that you go through where you invest. Every investment is like this, right? Other than maybe investing in index funds where you don't necessarily get this dip, but you invest, you spend a great deal of money up front, and then you wait to recuperate those returns. And those returns might be immediate, really immediate, but I would suspect that is less entrepreneurial, because you know that you're going to get a crystal clear return, right? You understand that there's an immediate return, but for things that are more entrepreneurial, more innovative, require a great deal more uncertainty, right? So things might actually have greater benefit, but at the sort of downfall that there's a great deal of uncertainty there. And so you run the risk of, because you're sort of doing these norm violations, you run the risk of feeling and experiencing a great deal of ridicule, great deal of shame, great deal of all sorts of negative emotions, right? That you are doing the wrong thing. It's like taking the risk. So this is a good analogy, right? So when you imagine that you are a kid and you know that you shouldn't eat. Somebody has sort of mentioned loosely at one point, yeah, don't eat those cookies in the cookie jar until after dinner. And you take the risk before then to eat those cookies, um, because they didn't sort of suggest it that day. They didn't tell you, maybe it's your parents didn't tell you not to eat out of that cookie jar that day, but just said sort of generally, don't do it. And so you take that risk, and then you put your hand in the cookie jar, and then your parents come in, right? And your parents look at you and say, "What are you doing?" And this is the sort of behavior. You took that risk, and what's happening because you took that risk and you sort of violated a norm, and it didn't work out the way that you planned it to work out, you feel just as if anybody else is going through these kind of things. You feel a great deal of shame. You feel negative affect in all sorts of ways. You feel that sort of, guilty feeling. I always imagine those puppy dogs that that they have the sort of the sort of guilt look on their face when they get in trouble. You see those pictures online; they're very cute. Um, but that's exactly what you feel, right? You go through like this is not right in how I'm responding. Like this is not necessarily a positive experience. So coming back to that idea, right? Of wasting resources, the idea is not necessarily exploration in a positive way. Not as where that sort of resource, you could deplete resources in a pretty innocuous or pretty painless way. You're sort of just exploring in a different sort of way, but more it's like wasting resources where you're throwing money out the window, you're spending time, you're going to run out of time. It's an uncomfortable pit in your stomach feeling. Then the feelings of I'm doing this just for pure blissfulness and joy, which there's some of that does happen, but there's also this very negative feeling, and the reason why I focus on the negative is because it is a cost to you, right? Every action is a cost to you that doesn't have an immediate reward, right? And that reward might be 10 years in the future. I prefer in the morning, I prefer to sleep in, and that feels nice, but man, I know I should get up a little earlier and get a little bit of exercise. And that little bit of exercise is a cost to me, and it doesn't feel great in the moment, but it does help out with sort of my longevity, at least I presume it does, and well-being, right? And so all of those behaviors, anything like that, feels like you're wasting resources in the immediate, for longer term benefit, and it feels negative. Eating broccoli feels negative in the moment, right? But I know that maybe there is some longevity there, who knows, by eating that broccoli and then get a little bit more benefit in the future. And that's what we sort of face, right? When we are actually doing something that's entrepreneurial, it's not necessarily that what you're going to do results in sort of positive outcomes. It's the same thing as eating broccoli. That I mean, to suggest that I'm going to eat broccoli and then I'm going to live an extra 15 years in my lifetime, that's a stretch, right? And it's the same sort of behavior that you're going through when you're doing entrepreneurial behaviors, is you are wasting resources, making yourself slightly uncomfortable, right? So for us, in my family, I sort of have this rule, kind of loose rule, is that I sort of waste 15% of everything that I ever make on creating the Reciprocity Project, and that includes my time and effort. That includes sort of revenue, that our family brings in, and give or take, right? It might be a little more, a little less, just some amount, some arbitrary amount, of roughly 10 to 15%, and just investing, just wasting resources that I don't think might not have any return in the future. I think it does, but I don't know when that return is going to happen. I presume that there might be a relationship, but I don't know. right? And that's how it feels. So the immediate cost of me giving that up. So in the sort of, in the relative terms, if you're making, $50,000 a year, which is probably a pretty average salary, you're giving up $5,000 of that. So that $5,000 is a significant amount that makes you go, oof, I don't like that. And so you have all of this pressure and sort of, a lot of negative feelings that you're experiencing when you're going through this, that there is no immediate return or benefit that you don't see other than your guiding principles. And this is where having that sort of gumption, having that perspective for the future really matters, right? It's not just about working through and doing difficult things, but it's also having that sort of, what is my guiding principle for the future? What is the sort of morality, ethical considerations for what I know is, or what I believe is right and just, because those things are somewhat, to some degree, I believe that they're somewhat entangled, right? The performance outcomes that you get in the long run generally adds value and is right or just in this world very far into the future. Um, and and all of this is somewhat challenging to reconcile in your head as you're actually going through it. So how do you waste resources appropriately so that you essentially don't go bankrupt, right? So that's the idea, is that you only have so many resources left, and you sort of think of, there's two ways that you can have resources, right? So you have your sort of immediate pile that you have right now, your endowments that you have, your reserves that you have, and then you think about generating resources in the long run. And what you have to think about is, if you deplete your pile of resources that you have, your sort of reserves that you have, then you're going to go bankrupt and you're going to run out. So how do you figure out what is the right combination for yourself, right? Like, how much of those resources should you be wasting? And the idea is not necessarily thinking about, just financial resources, but it's your time, it's your effort, it's sort of your emotional. I know that this is sort of defunct, but I like the idea of it. Defunct in the literature, but sort of ego depletion, right? So you only have so much that you can give of yourself before you feel, and the reason why I say that is it's been one of those ideas that in the last little while have been, ridiculed, I guess, within, or not ridiculed, but falsified within the sort of scientific literature. But the idea is really nice, because it suggests that you only have so much that you can give before you start getting exhausted. Your emotional state sort of depletes over time. Um, so, if you think about all these kind of resources, right? So you've got time, you have your own financial resources, you have maybe your relational resources, right? There's only so many relationships that you can sort of start and have. Well, what do you do, right? Like, how do you sort of, waste resources appropriately? Well, you set some sort of ratio, right? So you think about, in your life, how much can I afford to lose and have it disappear, right? So thinking about managing those particular losses. And then if you lose those losses, right, that you're not going to be terribly upset about it, right? So thinking about, and it works for all the resources, right? So you think about your time, you can waste 10% of your time doing things that are, you love and you're passionate about and you're excited about. But, granted, you likely will never get that time back. I was just at um, my son's fifth grade graduation. It was very cute, right? They're going into middle school, and, I was thinking about the people that dedicated their time to create this little ceremony. And all of that is a giant waste, right? Like, all of that is not, there's no return for them other than making it a really enjoyable experience for everybody else. And those people are sort of sitting back and they get a little clap at the end, but other than that, all of that time and effort is a complete waste. So thinking about how, and obviously if you waste 100% of your resources, right, you spend all of your time doing that, you don't have time for anything else. So you think about some sort of adequate ratio. Maybe you make that up in your mind. Maybe you actually have a set, like, fixed ratio in terms of financial resources that you're going to give 10%, right, towards something, or just freely giving it to things that you think are interesting, right? All of that is going to be a waste, right? You'll never get that back. You'll never feel, and that's the thing. If you're building something entrepreneurial, you may never get that back, right? And that's okay. And that's why you start thinking about it as kind of charity, right? So you change it around, and you're like, okay, I'm never going to get this back, but I think it's important. Maybe some people in this world might really need this, so why not give the time? Right. And then the other thing is thinking about you know to what that you should devote or waste your resources on. Well, that's a choice that you have to make, right? That is something that you think that you have to prioritize. It doesn't necessarily have to be an entrepreneurial venture of sorts. I mean, I think that's kind of ridiculous to think about that, right? Like, you have a certain amount of resources, and then you're thinking about, okay, how do I give those resources just to things that I enjoy, right? Maybe it's a playground in your neighborhood that you'd love to get built. That's not entrepreneurial in any sort of way, right? Like, but the sort of steps to get there, it kind of feels a little entrepreneurial, right? Like, you actually have to raise some money and stuff, but then you give of yourself to create that thing. Now, it's not just about financial resources, right? It's about your time, your effort, it's everything that you're doing, your attention. Attention's a resource, right? Like, all of the sort of things that are of you that are under your control, right? You have a locus of control, and all the different resources that you sort of can manage in some way. You just give it to things that you think have long-term potential to just create a better world, right? That's essentially it, right? There is something that you think is is lacking. Now, granted, we all have different definitions of a better world. Some of the better world depictions that people have are actually kind of nasty. They're not nice, right? Like, um, people do bad things, and they have sort of depiction of what a better world is, that might not necessarily be that good. Well, that's where you have to ask yourself, um, who is gonna benefit from this, and if it's gonna be a large group, and it's a tricky thing, right? Is it gonna be offensive to to some folks? This is where you have to think about the morality of what you're actually doing, and to sort of think about, what does it mean to be a good person? I can't make that judgment call for you. I know what it is for me. I don't necessarily know what it is for you, but hopefully, if you have an open heart, you sort of view the world in a sort of plurality as it is, then you're going to be more giving. Now, it could be, what you're doing is giving of, um, you know you, of any particular resource, but the idea is you are sort of giving somewhat freely, knowing that it's going to disappear. And so you're thinking about, you know, that this is a waste. You're thinking in your head, okay, now I know it's a waste, but how can I sort of do things that are good, right? And so this leads to the sort of second thing I was talking about, right? We have sort of resources that are at our fingertips, a sort of reserve of them, but then you also can grow it, right? And how you grow it is actually the same way is you keep wasting resources, right? And those resources are, thinking about maybe building relationships, right? Building a new relationship, it's highly likely that relationship will crash and burn, right? Like, everybody goes through this, as you get experience in life. There's only so many relationships that you actually sort of resonate with, and you might meet 1,000 people, and then you're only kind of really friends with like two people, right? And all of that sort of meeting of those 1,000 people are not necessarily, it's kind of a waste of your time, right? Like it's a rationally waste of your time. You should have focused on those two. But that means how you actually discover, how you meet new people, how you develop leaders, how you do all sorts of the things that are important to, maybe it's the culture of your organization, all the things that are in between, right? That are not necessarily about, creating that particular widget. It's all sort of wastefulness, but that wastefulness is growing the community. It's growing more of, just finding people is a waste. So we talk actually about, let me talk about this, right? So there's this idea of search costs, right? So there's lots of opportunities out there, but there's search costs that are involved to find those opportunities. Well, what does that mean, right? If you're actually doing that, that means you actually have to waste resources because it's a cost to actually get there. And so it feels like it's wasteful to, build relationships, to go to community events, to, spend time with your spouse, right? That is not in direct benefit to you in any sort of way. All of those things are very much quote unquote wasteful from a rational economic perspective. But that's only in the short term. Where the benefit actually comes, and you might not ever get it, right? Many of those relationships might not ever turn into anything, but you get it through long term relationships that you honor, you cherish, that you actually love, that people you trust. And the only way that you can build trust, the only way that you can build a community, the only way that people will stand up for you is if you stand up for them repeatedly over and over and over again until something actually happens, right? And so all of those efforts, it might take 10 years, it might take 20 years by the time you actually get any benefit, long-term benefit. Now, wasting resources, there's no like, there is absolutely no evidence of this, right? I can't sort of um, put my finger on this is the concrete evidence that I know. We just have sort of empirical simulation models that sort of suggest somewhat some of this stuff. Um, but you know, if you think about it, right? How do you grow opportunities? How do you make friends, right? Like, what does it mean to actually make a friend? To make a friend, sometimes you have to give a little present. Sometimes you smile. You do those little things. All of those things are emotional cost to you. Particularly if you don't know, you're very uncertain how those people are going to react to it. All of that is a cost, right? And as you're doing this, you might be wasting resources. You're reaching out first, but then when somebody responds back and with a big wide smile, there's something cool about that. And there is benefit there that you would not have actually achieved unless you wasted those resources to actually get there. So, to sort of sum up all of this, um, wasting resources, and it always feels like a waste, right? It seems like, do I need to do this? Do I have to do this? Is this a good thing? And you don't know what the answer is, right? It never is like, oh, okay. If I spend instead of the entrepreneur venture, talk about like my kids, right? I waste time with my kids to spend some time with them on the weekends, right? With the little activities that we do. And it often feels like, geez, Louise. But, when you go do it and you build that time, you build a relationship and they begin to love you and you begin to love them. And that benefit that is generated within those relationships, because you wasted resources, is enormously bigger than any of the sort of resources that you wasted along the way. And so if you wanted to create something, to build an entrepreneurial venture, it's all within the sort of soft stuff, right? That matters. Everything, if you think about what actually creates an organization, right? What creates meaning, what creates something that people actually like, that people trust, It is not the sort of cut and dry stuff. I could not care less about my garbage can, right? Like where, how it was manufactured, where it came from, because it's basically a commodity. What we care for are the things that there's actually meaning behind it. There's the soft stuff, the stuff that gives you the warm fuzzies, the things that, hey, I know what that means. I really understand that. I resonate with that, and I want to be part of that thing. And I think if you were to get there, how do you actually get there? It's the same way as what you teach in kindergarten. You make the first move, you smile, you waste all of those resources. Maybe you give a little chocolate bar, right? Like you do all those little tiny things that are complete waste to you in the moment, and it feels like that. But that's how you actually build trust. That's how you build relationships. That's how you get, uh, something that's bigger than what you are thinking. And that's how you actually build an entrepreneurial venture in the long run that people will cherish and value and love and see that there's actually something there. So it's not just about the technological assets, and technological capabilities. It's not just about sort of the marketing of trying to sell something, but it's thinking about how do I cherish and honor um, individuals, people that 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 I resonate with, and hopefully they resonate with me. And as you get practice doing that, you begin to realize, like, wait a minute, this is much bigger, right? Like this whole practice of wasting resources is really, really important, and yet is not talked about. Yet, we ignore the importance of wasting resources. We think that that is non-rational. We think that is kind of a silly thing to do, but it's actually the way that you build relationships, you build families, you love yourself, you waste resources on yourself that you would never do on a regular basis, and you think about, like, hey, this is actually a good thing for me to do and for other people as well. All right. Thank you.